Shalom, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for Self and Mystical Identity in 16th Century Kabbalah. We are on class number 3 today with Professor Eitan Fishbane, who is a professor of Jewish thought at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Since we're already on class 3, I'm not going to go through the whole bio, but I will copy and paste it in the chat in just a minute, as well as a few links for handouts for today's class. All right. Hi, Professor Fishbane.
Hi, Alex. Hi, everybody. So today we're turning to another element in the constellation of the mystical self. What will eventually be a chapter in the book version of this, and is also part of the larger conception of different dimensions of what constitutes constitutes personhood, selfhood, and identity among the Kabbalists, in particular the 16th century Kabbalists. And today, and I think also very much in keeping with one of the major themes of VBM, we're going to be turning to the question of mystical ethics and self-transformation in 16th century Kabbalah, after having spent our first two sessions talking about the question of core metaphysical identity, the soul, reincarnation, all that good and juicy stuff. And we're first going to be taking a slight step back in time to Moshe Cordovero, the Ramak, who preceded Isaac Luria and his disciples as the major leading figure in Tzfat in the 16th century, 1500s. Following Yosef Karo, that other major halachic and Kabbalistic figure. And of course, this, as I mentioned before, this place and time was a true spiritual, creative renaissance in Jewish history, in the history of Jewish spirituality. In terms of all kinds of creativity, and we discussed also various kinds of ritual innovations and liturgical poetry. But part of the question, as it seems to me, in seeking to identify the nature of selfhood, the nature of personhood, and also therefore the purpose of the human life and the way it should be lived, according to the Kabbalists of 16th century Tzfat, if this is one of their great themes, the question of the individual, understanding how they understood the process of self-transformation, aspiration toward self-perfection, moral ideals, and so forth, is very much key to this larger configuration of what constituted the imagined, the understood, the perceived nature of humanness and its purpose, a life and its purpose. So we first turn to the great mystical ethical classic of Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, the Ramak, known as called Tomer Devorah, the Palm Tree of Deborah, which some of you may already be familiar with. And here, Cordovero, on the one hand, was like the Thomas Aquinas, asynchronously to Kabbalistic thought. Many of his works were highly scholastic and metaphysical and intricate and systematic. And then he also wrote a few works that were clearly aimed at a broader, more accessible audience. both the work called Or Ne'erav, Sweet Light, which was a kind of introduction or primer to Kabbalistic theology, and then and then more significantly for our purposes, a mystical ethical manual called The Palm Tree of Deborah, Tomer Devora, which a short classic, which went on to be really, in many ways, a kind of fountainhead of the genre of Kabbalistic Musar as it began to develop out of 16th century Tzfat, and to have a tremendous influence on the development of Jewish ethics, Jewish mystical ethics in the centuries that followed, both including texts like Mesilat Yesharim, the Path of the Just of the Ramchal Moshe Chaim Luzzatto in Italy, and then very famously the Musar movement that grew out of the Volozhin Yeshiva in 19th century Poland, and also very importantly Hasidic moral and spiritual sources from the late 1700s and 1800s in Eastern Europe and Poland. So they're really developed in many ways. We can say that the rise of Kabbalistic Musar, the rise of mystical ethics in 16th century Tzfat, also had a major impact on the popularization or the spread of Kabbalah in modern Ashkenazi society. And as we're going to see here, also a kind of turn toward a psychologization and internalization of the metaphysical ideas of the Sfirot. Of course, we've already been talking about, because this is a series about the nature of the human self, right? We've been talking about the soul and the body and the interior of the person, but the Kabbalists were also very much metaphysical theologians who were very interested in the questions of the intricate mythology of the nature of divinity as flowing forces of energy called the Sfirot. But as developed both in earlier medieval sources and then in the 16th century and then beyond, there was a kind of psychologization of those same Sfirot, those same dimensions of God, to be understood as both, as we're going to see here, ethical pietistic ideals and dimensions of a kind of mystical psychology. So this text, which begins, as you can see, with his reflections on imitatio Dei, or on imitate your creator, or kind of attempt to emulate and realize one's existence, b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God, and asking the question, well, what does that mean, right? What does it mean to talk about the human self as created in the image of God? And what are the implications of that in terms of understanding the very nature of the human self and its aspirational purpose in life? So we're going to turn first to the first of two of the PDFs that relate to Cordovero. That we're going to jump around a little bit between these three. And maybe spill over with it a little bit also into next time, we'll see. But we're going to start with the text as it begins with imitate your creator, then you will enter the mystery. To vary the voices a little bit, if somebody would be so kind as to be our first reader of this English translation also by the venerable translator of Kabbalistic texts, Daniel Matt, in a volume you can see here from the title page. Actually, it doesn't say the Essential Kabbalah, it just says the Heart of Jewish Mysticism, but the title is the Essential Kabbalah. A wonderful volume that I teach from all the time and definitely recommend. So do we have a volunteer? Oh, we do have a volunteer. Beth, please.
Imitate your creator. When you will enter the mystery of the supernal form, the divine image in which you were created, if you resemble the divine in body but not in action, you distort the form. People will say of you, a lovely form whose deeds are ugly. For the essence of the divine image is action. What good is it if your anatomy corresponds to the supernal form while your actions do not resemble God's? So imitate the acts of Keter, the 13 qualities of compassion alluded to by the prophet Micah. Who is a God like you, delighting in love? You will again have compassion upon us. You will hurl all our sins into the depths of the sea.
So you can see. Thank you. So you can see from my little brackets and my little underlines and check marks, right? That you're getting this right out of my personal copy, and there are a number of very interesting things here that I just want to take note of. We'll also certainly have time, as we usually do toward the end, to have a little bit more give and take with conversation for the sake of covering a number of themes. Right. On the one hand, there is a sense, there was a belief that our very physical selves are theomorphic, right? That is to say, not just that God is anthropomorphic, that God is imagined in a kind of superhuman like form, as scholars of religion would say, and as we probably would say logically, but that according to the belief of religious practitioners, Telem Elohim, the image of God. Of course, we are in the form of divinity, even in our physical selves, in some respect, because we are theomorphic, right? We are forms of divinity. But he wants to say it's not just that. Certainly, it's only just very minimally that. Far more important is the essence of the divine image is action, right? How you are going to apply these dimensions of God in your behavior and in your life. And he starts with emulating or imitating the acts of Keter, which literally means crown, and it's the highest of the 10 sfirot. There, God in Kabbalistic metaphysics and theology is understood to be made up of 10 dimensions, 10 dynamic flowing rivers of divine energy and divine metaphysical light, called sfirot, not from the word sphere, but more from the sense of like sfirat haomer, the counting, or maybe sapphire, like sapphire. But the highest of them is called Keter. And what's most significant, crown, and that's also part of the larger Kabbalistic theology of us being theomorphic and so God therefore has a kind of almost regal like superhuman figure, right? With a crown that is worn. But even if we take it outside of that superhuman form, that anthropomorphic or theomorphic question, Keter, which is also called Ayin, Aleph Yud Nun, nothingness, and many other terms, nothingness not because it is nothing, but in some cases because no one can know anything really about it in its fullest sense, right? In other words, it represents a dimension of transcendence. But here also in the sense of the psychology or the moral, the behavior, the moral, the action emulation, it also becomes an emblem of avoiding excessive pride and ego, right? And thinking, right? Thinking, maybe this this is too extreme, as he says in other places, right? Thinking of yourself as nothing before the other person. That probably isn't necessarily the most psychologically healthy, given what we understand today. But this is part of how they understood it. At the very least, it's about underscoring the importance of humility over pride and ego. For our purposes here, at least initially, Keter is understood to contain within it, right, in this transcendent highest point of divinity, is understood to contain within it the Yud Gimel Midot HaRachamim, the 13 attributes of compassion that are recited on the high holidays. In other words, that the highest, most transcendent, purest form of divinity is pure, purest compassion, purest love. God is compassion and love. And if that sounds like another religion's teaching, it's because Judaism has a lot in common with that religion, and with other religions as well. But the idea that God is love, that God is compassion and rachamim, specifically in God's essence, is central to Kabbalah and to various aspects of Judaism. There have been a number of things that have been written about this and that are forthcoming, about reclaiming the centrality of both God as an expression of love and the human being's imperative to love God. So here the idea is that within Keter there are these 13 qualities of compassion, these Yud Gimel Midot HaRachamim, and they are the very purest essence of the divine self. And therefore, if we are to emulate the divine self and we are to aspire toward a kind of realization of the divine self as Tselem Elohim, then we must first and foremost, just like all of God's self flows forth from this essential fountain of rachamim, of compassion and empathy, and love, so too must we, in our moral, spiritual, psychological lives, ground all of our actions in the fundamental force of compassion. And the question is, what does that mean, right? How will we have all of our actions, even when they require deen, even when they require judgment or severity, how will they still be animated by compassion? So let's turn to the next paragraph to see how this begins to be expressed. And Beth, would you like to read that paragraph, or would someone else like to pick it up? Would you like to go ahead?
I can. May I interject a question?
Sure. Though I'd like to save more of our conversation for the end, but sure, go ahead.
Do we have multiple systems of how these sefirot work? And the reason I ask that is I thought that Keter was one of the inaccessible and unknowable sefirot. And
yes,
us human beings were associated with those lower down on the tree, as it were. And so it leads me to the question of how would we even know that these qualities of compassion were associated with Keter?
Yes. So we'll save a deeper discussion of that for a little bit later. But I'll just say very briefly that you're absolutely right, that Keter in part, as reflected in the fact that it's also called Ayin, Aleph Yud Nun, nothingness, right? That nothing can be known, that it is transcendent, was certainly understood that way by many Kabbalists. But there was also there were also different views of some of these things, and how and to what extent can certain elements of the Sfirot be known. In fact, there was one Kabbalist from the 13th, 14th century, Isaac of Akko, who I spent quite a number of years in conversation with, that resulted in my first academic book, Is Light Before Dawn, The Inner World of Medieval Kabbalists, who actually argued that the mind should try to ascend all the way to Ein Sof, to infinity, as that was a kind of locale of consciousness, and from there to go to the other sphere. Let's bracket that just a little bit, just a little bit further for now. And here he is asserting that at the very top, before anything else manifests of divinity, and maybe that's related to this question of what is transcendent and what is manifest, before dimensions of God, and then also of the human as the human being emulates the divine self, there is just pure compassion, right? With no intermixture of other emotions. And we haven't yet gotten even to the question of Chochmah and Bina and Chesed and Gevura, right? Of issues of knowing, of issues of grace versus severity, and so on. So the fundamental principle, as I was mentioning before, is that here the ideal self, the aspirational self, is one that seeks to first and foremost be loving, compassionate, and empathic like God, and have all of one's actions, even if they have other valences and manifestations as they go lower down the chain, to still be animated by that fundamental compassion, rachamim, empathy, and love. So here he gives us, in this next paragraph, he gives us a kind of ethical imperative. So if you wouldn't mind reading for us, you should desire the well-being of your fellow creature.
You should desire the well-being of your fellow creature, eyeing his good fortune benevolently. Let his honor be as precious to you as your own, for you and your fellow are one and the same. That is why we are commanded, love your neighbor as yourself. You should desire what is right for your fellow. Never denigrate him or wish for his disgrace. Just as God desires neither our disgrace nor our suffering because of our close relationship with him, so you should not desire someone else's disgrace, suffering, or ruin. You should feel as bad for such suffering as if it were your own. Similarly, rejoice over another's good fortune as if you were basking in it.
So there are, thank you. So there are a number of really interesting statements here, which we will and we'll circle back to some of this both in this session and in the next session, because I think it's extremely important and relates both to moral ideals and the question of emotions in the nature of the self, which I think blends together in some ways, and we'll also see this perhaps in a text by Isaiah Horowitz, and also a text today by at least attributed to Isaac Luria, here saying, always wish for the best and for good fortune for your fellow creature, and let their honor be as precious to you as your own, for you and your fellow are one and the same. Love your neighbor as yourself, which is actually which on the one hand is a very beautiful notion. On the other hand, if we stop and think about it, it also underscores the idea that our most primal, powerful sense of love and well-being is to a certain extent self-interest and self-love, right? It's that you should love someone as much as you love yourself, right? If you can love someone as much as you love yourself, then that's pretty great, right? So that would also seem to indicate a kind of veiled awareness that we do have a kind of strong, whether it's a survivalist instinct or whether it's a sense of self-love and self-compassion, which is also extremely important. But nevertheless, right, because there are other versions of articulating the ideal of love your neighbor as yourself, which is found in Leviticus, but you also find this statement, the famous statement, both of Hillel and then of that which is hateful to your neighbor, do not do unto that which is hateful to you, do not do unto your neighbor, right. The rest is commentary, go and learn. And essentially we see the same version of that in the Sermon on the Mount in the New Testament, and I think that there's good reason to argue that in many ways Jesus of Nazareth was of a kind of intellectual lineage of the school of Hillel at the time, right, as opposed to Shammai, who was part of the Sanhedrin at the time of Jesus. So these ideas were actually deeply shared. But you should specifically not. You should desire what is right and good for your fellow, and that should be the commandment, the imperative of V'ahavta l're'echa kamocha. You should love your neighbor or your fellow as yourself, and you should never denigrate them or wish for their disgrace or suffering or ruin. And you should feel as bad for such suffering as if it was your own, right? In other words, true empathy, right? Not even necessarily just sympathy, which indicates a kind of remove from the object, as it were, of mercy or compassion, right? Mercy, I don't like quite as much because it has a kind of narcissism about it. And also the idea of pity has an element of narcissism about it as well. And there have actually been those who have talked about that around the question of forgiveness in terms of its potential for narcissism, both Martha Nussbaum and Moshe Halbertal in different ways. But what it's saying here specifically is that you should not denigrate another person. You should not embarrass them, disgrace them, or wish for that, or their suffering or their ruin. And you should care about it as much as your own self-interest to not be disgraced, right? Again, this idea that it will help us understand how important it is if we frame it in the sense of that we wouldn't want to experience that, right? Or treat other people how you want to be treated, as not only Hillel and Jesus and others, but also our kindergarten teachers teach us as well, right? It's a fundamental sense of fairness and of the just, right? Even if we look at the core principle behind John Rawls' theory of justice in his famous book, both the inviolability of the individual for the sake of the larger community, which is itself a controversial principle, but also the very notion of justice as fairness. Justice as fairness. So there's a strong push toward this question of empathy and compassion. And if we just skip ahead to the next page 3 of the packet, and it's where we see a variety of articulations of this, right? This is how you should behave toward your fellow human being. Don't bear a grudge from the anger that you felt, right? That's perhaps easier said than done, and therefore a kind of very powerful, aspirational moral ideal, right? And even try to cultivate a more intimate relationship with them than those who have been completely righteous with you, right? Which he says elsewhere here, and which we know from the tradition that says that those who are ba'alei teshuvah, those who repent from previous misdeeds, are even more righteous than those who were perfect from the beginning. And these are some of the qualities by which you resemble your creator: the sublime qualities of compassion, of rachamim, have a precious characteristic. Just as you conduct yourself below, so are you worthy of opening the corresponding sublime quality above. Exactly as you behave, so it emanates from above, and you cause that quality to shine in the world. So there's a kind of theurgical, like impacting the divine element to one's moral, spiritual moral actions, right? These sublime qualities of enacting compassion and empathy and love. Not only are you doing good in a kind of abstract and even concrete way, and not only are you embodying divinity in your actions, but you are also stimulating theurgically the flow of God's very luminous self through the cosmos, the universe, the world. You are bringing that quality of divinity in emanational flow and life force down into the lower world, and causing that quality to shine in the world, which seems to be very significant here, right? Because that's a core element of Kabbalistic thought, that what we do in this world has a direct impact upon the divine world. It's a theurgical principle of tikkun, right? Where tikkun olam comes from, is that what we do in this world, both for the negative and for the positive, has a stimulating effect upon drawing down the divine energies, upon affecting God's very self. And so what we do in this world, in this case, a life of moral practice and attitude and posture, and specifically that of having rachamim, compassion, empathy, love, animate everything, affects the whole world, affects the whole universe, affects God's very self, affects God's very self. Right, as Beth had pointed out, right, in this, you can see there with that arrow that I have there in the margin. Although Keter transcends all the other qualities, nevertheless, it is supposed to represent the ideals of humility, right? That our ability to be truly compassionate stems from being able to get over our own egos, to be able to be humble enough to do that, right? And that is a fundamental principle. And interestingly, also, it talks about a kind of embrace of the whole the whole chain of being. God nourishes everything from the horned buffalo to nits, disdaining no creature. For if God disdained creatures due to their insignificance, they could not endure for even a moment. And we see a very powerful articulation of this centuries later in the writings of Rav Kook and others, for sure, that all creatures are of great significance, and they all are imbued with divinity. But rather you as a person, in realizing your best self, your aspirational self, you should gaze and emanate compassion upon them all. In other words, rather, that's what God does, and you should emulate that. So should you be good to all creatures. So you should be good to all creatures, all creatures. I'll have to remember that the next time I encounter a mosquito. disdaining none. Even the most significant creatures should assume importance in your eyes. Attend to it, do good to whomever needs your goodness. But I want us to before we enter a period of where we can have some Q&A and some discussion, and I think that we'll definitely have a part two of this as it relates to both emotion and moral practice next time. I want to share with you this next piece, which is also really a kind of mindful meditation or embodied meditation about this very thing. It says, this is at the bottom of page 84 of the Essential Kabbalah, your forehead should not be tense at all, right? Good luck to us, but that's our goal. But rather always resemble the forehead of the will, or ratzon, which is another term for keter, ratzon, will. And why should it be not tense and resemble that highest form of divinity? So that you soothe everyone. So that you soothe everyone. Right? We first need to have a kind of calmness in our own embodied self, which and this also reminds me of the way in which our consciousness and practice of tuning into our bodies is deeply related to our emotional consciousness and growth and transformation in mindfulness practice that grows out of Buddhist and neo-Buddhist practice as well, right? So the first part of this, let's say, Kabbalistic mindfulness, almost yoga-like meditation, is to first imagine your forehead muscles, your forehead tension relaxing, and get yourself attuned to a posture of soothing and compassion toward other people, which, as we learned both from Buddhist practice and I think also from these texts, that begins also with a kind of self-compassion and self-love, right? That's not necessarily egoistic self-love, though there's a place for ego in life, I think, as long as it's kept in check. But it's also about how do we have, as the Buddhists teach us, how do we have compassion and love for ourselves enough that we can nurture ourselves so that we can then send that out as spiritual and moral energy to others. So even if you come across angry people, and I'm sure we never do that, none of us are ever angry ourselves or encounter other angry people, right? But actually, this is the perennial human condition. Soothe and calm them with your goodwill, like you're imagining your forehead to be calm. For the forehead of the will, meaning the ratzon, meaning keter, which is the font of all rachamim and calm and tranquility, that was my insertion, constantly accepts and soothes the harsh powers, reintegrating them. Right, so there is an idea in Kabbalah of hamtakat hadinim, or the sweetening of the judgments, or the soothing and tranquilizing and calming of the negative energies of harshness, right? In both in ourselves and in others, right? So when we're feeling I'm inserting this a little bit, but it extends from this because how can just as we can't extend compassion truly to another person if we don't have self-compassion, not both because it takes practice, right, but also because we ourselves need a little love too, right? So too, how can I soothe the angry or the harsh forces or the judging forces, the dinim, until I have reintegrated them and calmed them in myself, just as Keter, the highest of the Sfirot, is like this, let's say, metaphysical pool of tranquility, where when the forces of judgment and harshness and anger are reabsorbed into that pool of tranquility, they become calmed, right? They become soothed. So to imagine how that happens in ourselves, right? Induce them. So you should soothe those overwhelmed by anger, right? Or don't, when possible, don't meet fire with fire. Don't meet anger with anger, because that will only escalate, right? Instead, try to soothe them, induce them with goodwill. Of course, there are examples we can talk about how that doesn't always work, and of course we can, and of course that's also the question of how things manifest in lower realms of ourselves and of the world, right? And even of God, right? There is a place for din, severity, harshness, judgment, combat, even within divinity, but it must always be guided at its root by the force of empathy, compassion, and love, right? If we are not grounded in rachamim at some level, then we would say we lose our true humanity, which is that which is an embodiment, a manifestation of divinity. Induce them to goodwill, drawing on great wisdom to extinguish their anger before it transgresses the boundary and causes damage, God forbid. Right? So, in other words, try to soothe the angry person, even though there are also classic rabbinic statements that say don't try to talk to somebody in the moment of their anger, and there's probably also wisdom in that too, right? It takes a special ability to be able to do this, and not all of us are able to do it at all times anyway. But the question is, how can this be done both with ourselves? Let's think about it. How can we soothe ourselves, right? Imagining the calming of our foreheads as a physical image before our own anger can get the better of us, and we can lose our temper, right? Or our limbic system, our amygdala can take over, and instead imagine that our forehead represents, I'm channeling my amateurish understanding of the neurobiology of this, right? We can channel our higher mind. We can channel our prefrontal cortex mind, that where we find empathy, as opposed to just being guided by the smoke alarm of the amygdala in ourselves, and then also in others. Model yourself on the will, on Keter, which emanates from the wondrous wisdom in the forehead of the ancient one, meaning even the higher dimensions, even beyond Keter, from where it soothes everything. From there derive the power to be genial with others, because if your character is somewhat harsh, people will not be soothed. Maybe they'll even be defensive. This is why the Mishnah teaches, if the spirit of people delights in someone, so does the spirit of God. And looking down here before we turn to some discussion, trying to channel compassion and compassionate behavior and empathy and attitude as much as possible. Your face should always be shining. Welcome each person with a friendly countenance, right? That b'sever panim yafot, it says in the tradition also, right? That the more we can exude that shining, friendly presence of genuine care and love, right? Whether this is a kind of care ethics, a kind of relational ethics, it feeds off of each other. We feed off of each other. It affects our own inner balance and temperament, and then affects others as well. And in doing all of that, we are emulating the rachamim of God. So there's a lot more to talk about here, and we will continue with this and the other related PDFs, and maybe even something else with that as part two of this question of moral self-transformation and the emotions next time. But for our remaining time, I'm sure there are thoughts, questions, burning existential issues that may have been raised by this, right? How can we cultivate this meditation of imagining the calming of our forehead as a kind of way to get in touch with the emotion of tranquility, empathy, and compassion? So I'll turn it over to Alex, the moderator.
Yes, thank you so much. Would love to take a few questions or comments. Please feel free to use the chat, or you can raise a hand and we can call on people and you can unmute and speak.
So kind of relating to Beth's question about Keter being beyond us, there's also the idea that all of the Sferot are in all the Sferot. So even when you're in Asiyah, there's sort of a Keter of Asiyah and each of the Sferot. So
nice.
Yeah.
Beautiful, right? So I think, right, there's right, there's both Moshe Idel's classic article about this in the Middle Ages of Sfirot, Sheme'ala Sfirot, that there are Sfirot above Sfirot, or as we see in a lot of different Kabbalistic texts, there are Sfirot within Sfirot, within Sfirot, within Sfirot, ad infinitum, literally, right? And we have the Sfirot inside of ourselves. It's like the imprint of our psychology. That is what it is to be B'Tselem Elohim, right? We manifest the Sfirot, and the Sfirot are part of the world. So both the energies are always interconnecting, and each one affects the other. Even as we strive to connect ourselves with this fundamental anchor of Keter as Yud Gimel Midot Harachamim, above all and at the heart of all, right? Let that be the calm of our forehead. Let that be at the center of our heart when we place our right hand over our heart in an act of self-nurturance and compassion, as the wonderful Buddhist mindfulness teacher Tara Brach teaches. Some of you may be familiar with her work, her teaching. And we also see that same gesture also in Lurianic Kabbalistic texts as well, like placing the hand on the heart in an act of prayer, and the right hand as an act of self-nurturing and prayer is also in tune with the idea that the right is understood to symbolize rachamim even more. Of course, that was because they were biased towards lefties, but that's another story.
Thank you. I see something just came in the chat. I can read it out loud. It says, I do try every day to treat others as I would treat myself. As you said, we learned that even before kindergarten. But the current Israel-Hamas war is an unsolvable conundrum for me. How do we, as decent people, Jews, Israel, show compassion for Hamas? Tough question.
This is an intense question, and truly of Inyana Diyoma, of the issues of the day, and I think that part of how I would at least partially gesture toward that, though I don't have the full wisdom of an answer to that kind of a question, or even how we if we need to show true empathy toward other manifestations of evil in history, how do we do that? Or how do we do that towards someone who's behaving in a morally reprehensible way in all kinds of manifestations, right? And I guess part of how I would answer that question is that just as there is, right, almost Kohelet, like just as there is a time for Deen within God, there is a time for Deen within our humanness. our human selves, but we should never lose our grounding in the Yud Gimel Midot HaRachamim, right? We should never lose our humanity amidst all of it, right? We should never lose our ability to have empathy and care, and that might not mean a one-to-one correlation toward specific people or groups of people who are causing severe harm, but the grounding of how can we not lose our deepest humanity, which is that we must be compassionate and empathic in this world, or else we lose our humanity. Right? That's not to say that there isn't a place for deen and strength and the need to sometimes rise up in deen and gevura, right? But that deep within it must dwell those midot rachamim that should guide our sense of what it is to be a human being.
Thank you. I think we can try to squeeze in one more comment or question. Beth, I see your hand up.
This isn't Kabbalah, but it pertains to the question that was raised. The late Marshall Rosenberg developed a system of nonviolent communication. And in a nutshell, it involved recognizing the common needs that each human being, we all share. On the other hand, he also was an advocate for the self-protective use of force, because we each get to live and nobody gets to kill us while we just passively, sit still for it. We get to resist. That's part of a human need too. And most human beings would actively resist if someone were attacking them. So that's a 20th century perspective on the question about what do we do with this current situation. It's a lot easier to feel compassion for all those people who have no water and whose babies are in incubators being rushed to Egypt. I feel enormous compassion for them. But it's awfully hard for most of us probably to feel compassion for the people who masterminded what set this all off in the first place.
Right. I think that's very important and deep. And I was just recently also reading Marshall Rosenberg's book on NBC and this right, nonviolent communication and this question and how that relates also to self-defense as well. I think that's very important, right? So it's kind of there. It's the dialectic of Din and Gevura as protecting the life, but also the ability to be always grounded and open to the rachamim and the compassion, right. And as I think was just said in the chat, these are themes that are very much right are very much part of a number of different spiritual traditions as well. So we will return to this topic. So fear not. Maybe not this. We can return to this specific element of this topic too. But we will return to this question of grounding ethics in love, which actually is also a theme that's argued by one of my philosophical heroes, Martha Nussbaum, particularly in her book Political Emotions: Why Love Matters for Justice, which is an interesting sequel to her book Upheavals of Thought: The Intelligence of Emotions and the kind of primacy of compassion and empathy and all of that.
Great. Thank you so much. We look forward to seeing everyone again, same time next week for class number 4. And also next Wednesday, we just added a new class, Jewish Military Ethics, with Rabbi Eitan P, which will be at 10 a.m. Mountain Time. So maybe you can join me in a VBM doubleheader and attend both classes. Thanks, everyone.